Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Well, thank you, Bob Kincaid. It's great to hear that voice again. It's great to be on the air again at the Virtual Center. I hope everybody has been well. I know that I have missed being here. I hope that at least a little bit you kind of missed the programs being on a regular basis. But as we know, Bob and Agnes were on a well-deserved vacation, and that meant that we didn't have anybody to produce the program. So for the last week, we've not been able to do a program. And this is our first day live in quite a while. And of course, as we know, on the national level, in fact, from where I'm standing in West Virginia, on the state level as well, an awful lot has transpired since the last time we were together. I'd like to touch on a few of those things at the beginning of our program today, and then get into something which is a little bit more relevant. And then eventually, if not sometime during our first hour, then definitely in our second hour today, I'd like to share with you some of the work that I've been doing over the last 4 or 5 days, and share with you where I am, where I think I'm going, and what I hope to accomplish as I get there. But first, I want to remind everybody of the details of our program. As you know, we kind of feature our program and trust that as much as possible, it's going to be what Bob Kincaid in his introduction to us each day refers to as an ongoing conversation. And what that essentially means is that we have included as part of our operation here an opportunity for you, those of you out there listening to this program, to participate actively in it. And you can do that by getting on the air and reacting directly over something that I might have said, positive or negative, or making a comment generally about some of the things that we traditionally talk about or have talked about in the past, or even some of the issues, some of the postings that I have chosen to put on our Facebook page. Our phone number, if you would like to get on the air, and I would love to hear from you because it's been so long since we've been together, and I'm kind of off my game, understandably, because from my own situation, we had kind of a rocky couple of weeks the last time we were together. I missed a few programs, and Bob and Annette were required to miss a few programs as well. And then when they had the opportunity to go on this vacation, which they really hadn't been on for so long, along with many of you, I encouraged them to go. So the reality is that we've not really been together for a long time, and I would love to hear from some of you. Our phone number hasn't changed. It's area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. My email address, and I know it's becoming increasingly less common for people in today's world of social media to use email as a way of communication. For a time, as many of you will know, remember, over the last several years, it's been kind of the major means of communication. But of late, social media seems to have edged it out of the way a little bit, and fewer and fewer folks seem to be utilizing email. But the fact of the matter is it's a good way to directly communicate with each other. I personally am not a texter, and part of the reason is because I'm not that proficient at typing. Especially on the phone. So, as much as possible, I'll go to either email or communication or comments through through Facebook. But that's just for my own personal convenience. But we do have, I do have an email address. I would love to hear from you. It gives you the opportunity to sit down and compose. You're not limited as you are on Twitter or many of these other social media outlets to 140 characters or anything else. You can sit down and compose your argument. And if you don't want to go on the air yourself, by giving us a call at the phone number I just shared with you, 663-4676, area code 304. Then you can send me an email and compose exactly what you want to say and how you want to say it, and I'd be more than happy to share it with our listeners and get it on the air for you. So I do encourage you to utilize, take advantage of the email opportunity if it really works for you. My email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906 at gmail.com. And then finally, I do recommend and remind you of our Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, if you are a regular user of Facebook, and I know so many millions of folks are, if you go to the homepage, facebook.com, you'll see its search box at the top. And if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you'll be on our Facebook page, and you'll encounter some of the postings that I've put there. And I think the most recent ones are links to articles that I thought were particularly beneficial for folks who listen to this program on a regular basis to read. I believed in each case that the particular article, the link to which I put on our Facebook page, would be worth your while. And as many of you are aware, if I do put a link on Facebook, I will explain why I'm putting it there. In other words, I'll put a paragraph or two there about the article in question. I don't recommend or give you a link to anything that I haven't read myself. And so, if I read it and it seems like something that I think you would gain benefit from, then I will, if I do have time, I'll put the link on Facebook and jot down a few comments about it to let you know why I think this is an article that might be worth your time. And then you can use your own judgment as to whether you might agree or disagree or whatever. And then if you do and you want to comment, there's an opportunity on Facebook to comment. You can put a comment on our Facebook page. You can send me an email. You can pick up the phone and call our 663-4676 number. The issue is we want to do everything we can do to make what Bob calls in his introduction an ongoing conversation a reality. Because I think all of you will appreciate and understand, because I think we all agree, that it's the need to communicate, to interact back and forth, that enables all of us to learn from each other and all of us to grow as more and more of what's going on in today's world becomes more relevant and more vital to our own way of life here in America. I really believe that this is an important vehicle, an important opportunity. I love it. We're well into our fourth year. We're beyond 6 months into our fourth year of broadcasting here at the Virtual Center. And I know we're probably not as dutiful in being on at our scheduled times as much as we should be, at least of late. But I hope that we will rectify that. However, I do need to inform you that Bob just told me this, that Bob is going to has an appointment tomorrow, and there's not going to be anybody in the studios to produce our program. So we won't be live tomorrow, but we will be back on Wednesday. So with that, then let's get into a little bit of the program, a little bit of some of the issues that are happening around us. Let me share with you one thing that some of you might want to know about, because it might confuse you. So let me tell you exactly what this is. It's not a big deal. but it's something that I think I want our listeners to know about. And that refers specifically to our Facebook page. Beginning this Wednesday morning, and it will not, I hope, affect our program here on the Virtual Center on Wednesdays or Mondays. But beginning on Wednesday, we're beginning a new academic semester in our colleges and universities, and I think they're cranking up this week in a number of different places, and I think all of you are fully aware of it. Here where I'm broadcasting from, which is in Beckley, West Virginia, of course, we have kind of a new dude in town, so to speak. It's West Virginia University Institute of Technology, affectionately to the people that really support it, known as West Virginia Tech. Many of you will know that I taught a class in this past spring on an emergency basis because one of the full-time faculty members there suffered a heart attack with only 5 weeks to go in the semester. And the university called me and asked me if I would pinch hit and finish out the semester for him, and I did that. And I know many of you will remember that, because I know I talked about it quite a bit here. If you don't remember it, then let me jog your memory. 2 of the classes I taught were on history of science and technology, and I spent quite a bit of time talking about that here at the Virtual Center. So that might ring a bell with some of you if you're not really don't remember that well what I was talking about. Anyway, the university has asked me if I would teach one class this semester. It's a class that will meet at 8 a.m. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It's a 50-minute class that'll meet 3 days a week for the full semester, which is 16 weeks long. The class will end with a final exam in mid-December, the 13th of December, I believe. So I'll be beginning that class this coming Wednesday morning. Why do I mention that here at the Virtual Center? Because one of the vehicles that I want to use in order to teach this class will be our Facebook page. I have found in the past, and I think you will appreciate and understand what I mean by this, I have found Facebook to be very, very valuable in terms of its ability as a vehicle for communication. In my own personal case, given the way that I teach, the Facebook page provides me with an opportunity to make historical primary sources, documents, available to students rather than print off hard copies. And let me tell you why this is such a problem. I understand going into the class, which starts 2 days from now, day after tomorrow, that currently I have 68 students registered for this class. What that means is that every time I would reproduce something, a hard copy of a particular document, I would need 68 copies of every page. That, to me, is intimidating. It's intimidating for the amount of paper, and I don't want to do that. So what I have concluded is that the availability of our Facebook page might really make it possible to share some of these documents with students and at the same time avoid the extensive copying, which I would like to avoid. So consequently, I'm going to be posting a number of things related to the class I'm teaching on our Facebook page. I will flag those items. In other words, I still want to use the Facebook page for issues and information related to this program. So what I will do is if there's something on the Facebook page that relates to the class I'm teaching at West Virginia Tech, I will indicate that by suggesting to you that this particular posting is directed at students in the History 152 course, which is the United States history class I'm teaching. So when I meet with them on Wednesday and go over the course syllabus and explain to them how the course will be structured and organized and what I'll be expecting them to do and the number of exams they have and other things. I will make them aware of the Facebook page. In fact, I'll be handing out a hard copy of the syllabus that I have, which I put together right now. As it stands right now, it's 6 pages long. So tomorrow, the day before the start of classes, I'm going to go up and have 68 or 70 copies of a 6-page document made. I hope that I don't have to do that frequently during the course of the semester. That's why I want to make use of our Facebook page. But I do want you to know that we'll still be using the Facebook page for the materials we're dealing with here at the Virtual Center. And again, I will flag the history class material as material directly related to the History 152 course. And then you'll know that that particular item is principally on there for the students in this class. That doesn't mean you can't read them. I think you'll enjoy some of these documents. They're rich. Many of these documents are really significant. I think that in order to teach the survey course in American history, access to these documents is critical. And as I won't go through all of that here, but I think over the years that we've been together here at the Virtual Center, you know my fondness for primary source materials and requiring students to wrestle with them. I think it's the quickest, most direct way to promote critical thinking. It requires that students read more critically, that they ask questions of what they read. It presumes that they understand what they read and ask questions of it. And the real education happens when they pursue the answers to questions that they themselves raise about a particular historical item. So I'm a big fan of historical documents. I think you'll recognize that. How many times here in the Virtual Center am I quoting a particular paragraph from a Federalist paper or from a letter that one of the founders wrote or something like that? In fact, I'll be doing quite a bit of that in today's program, I expect, later on. So that's really what I'm doing, and I just want to alert you that if you begin to see things on our Facebook page with the History 152 flag on them or introduction to them, you won't be confused, and that you'll understand what they're there for, why they're there, and the advantage I'm doing. For me, it's a way to expose students to materials without requiring them to buy very expensive printed materials. Most of these documents are available on the internet. But I think if I can pull them off the internet and put them, all the relevant ones, on our Facebook page, it's going to be most beneficial for students. And what I'm going to tell them is that, a particular document, if they really want to make their own hard copy of it, they can do that. It'll print out in a page or two or whatever. But for me to ask the university to pay for 68 or 70 or 75 copies of a particular document over and over again, it seems to me is not fair. It's not right. It's not environmentally friendly, to be honest with you. And I just don't want to do it that way. So I thought that this would be the best choice. Students can use their own judgment as to whether they want to make a hard copy or whether they just want to copy and paste the particular document that I put there and put it on their own, create their own Word document or PDF file, however they want to do it, and retain the document for themselves. If they want a hard copy, or if they're comfortable just having it available on their own computer or whatever, that's pretty much their call. But I'll be doing that, and it will be beginning this week. The class will begin on Wednesday. I won't be using primary documents on Wednesday. It'll take me a few days to get into the class, especially with 68 people. When I first started to teach in the early 1970s, I can remember that I had a class with 115 people in it, and I was just fresh out of graduate school. It frightened me to death. So I'm not worried about the size of the class in terms of teaching it. What I am worried about, of course, is the testing and the exams. And more importantly, what bothers me is it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to know the names of all of these people. I can't afford in a 50-minute class that meets 3 times a week, I can't afford to take roll each day, because it would take half the class to go through 68 or 70 names. So what I'm going to be required to do, which makes me a little bit uncomfortable, is assign seats. What I'm going to tell students is to make sure they're sitting where they want to be sitting, because I'm going to require that once they pick a place, they stay there. And then I'll make a seating plan. And that way I can just basically look and see who's missing on a particular day. And that's the only way that I can take roll without consuming a whole lot of time. And so with that, with that introduction, I just wanted to explain that'll be happening this Wednesday for me, early in the morning. But again, I will be home well in time to do our regular 1 p.m. Session here at the Virtual Center. So again, I remind you that we won't be live tomorrow, but I do plan to be with you on Wednesday. And I think probably the first thing I'll be doing on Wednesday is letting you know what it's like to stand in front of a group that large at 8 o'clock in the morning. The person who scheduled the class and asked me to teach it, the division chair, told me, and she's kind of right, that she thought that 8 a.m., she knows that I have a number of things that I'm involved in, and she felt that most of them wouldn't be interrupted by a class that met from 8 to 9 in the morning. And she's right. Most people aren't doing anything else. I think the fact that there were 70 of us in a history class at 8 a.m. 3 days a week probably is going to mean that, at least in this area, that there aren't that many other things happening that early. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm a little bit intimidated by it, but I think that's always good. It's good to be a little bit nervous, because I really think it keeps you on your game. As I mentioned a few moments ago, I feel that way today here at the Virtual Center, because it's been so long since we've been together that I'm a little bit uptight about today's program. But I think once we get into it, we'll be fine. So welcome. Again, if you are so inclined, by all means, feel free to pick up the phone and give us a call at area code 304-663-4676. Let me tell you, first of all, a few of the updates that have occurred since we've been together here on the Virtual Center over the last week. This is particularly pertinent to West Virginia, but as you'll see, it's not directly involving only West Virginia. In fact, if there's really substance to this story, if this really works out the way it looks like it might, then I think all of us are going to be affected by the results of the story that I'm about to tell you. And this has been consuming political interest here in West Virginia for the last 4 or 5 days. Many of you will recall that in a 1-week period, beginning about 4 weeks ago, about a month ago, during the Boy Scout Jamboree that was taking place here in southern West Virginia, on the first Monday of Jamboree week, President Trump made an appearance and spoke early in the evening to the assembled scouts. And there were thousands of them. I've seen numbers in the papers suggesting between 35,000 scouts who were there for President Trump's address. And as you'll recall, the president's address became quite an issue of conversation. Very simply, without going back through the whole thing, because the president took the occasion to turn the address to the Boy Scouts into a political rally for himself. He introduced a lot of politics in it. He made specific political requests to the Scouts about his effort to get health care passed, or his inability to get it passed in the Senate. And as you'll know, that was followed over the coming couple of weeks with an attack by the president on the competence of Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate. And that, of course, occurred just this past week. The result was that 2 or 3 days after the president's address on a Monday, a key spokesman for the Boy Scouts apologized to the Scouts, to their families, and to the nation for the inappropriate nature of the president's comments. The president approached these Scouts not with the kind of message that the opportunity to speak to this number of young men at the same time presented, but rather to turn it into a political rally of sorts, which many people believed was extremely inappropriate. I've said that here at the Virtual Center myself. I thought it was embarrassing. I did not watch. I turned it off in the middle because I was so appalled by how inappropriate it was. The president attacked Hillary Clinton. He attacked the Democrats. He attacked the Republicans' inability in the Senate to get health care through. He talked about the size of his electoral victory. He raised questions about the so-called millions of illegal voters that actually deprived him of the popular vote as well as the electoral vote, and a number of other things that were really, I think, very inappropriate given the opportunity and given the audience that he was speaking to. The very next Monday after that, the president came back to West Virginia. And this time he spoke to a large rally in Huntington, West Virginia. And that also was a political rally for him. The only difference was it was a little bit more appropriate, although one wonders why a president that's only 6 months into his first term would still be giving political rallies. And that relates to the president's ongoing efforts to strengthen and communicate with his base and all the rest of it. We've talked about that. That address occurred in Huntington, West Virginia. But something else happened that evening as part of the president's trip here. Before the president came to West Virginia on the afternoon of that Monday, before his trip to Huntington, the president announced that there was going to be a big announcement later that evening in Huntington, West Virginia. The president had something important and very significant to announce, not only to West Virginia, but to the rest of the country. And as many of you will recall, if you tuned in here to the Virtual Center right after that, you'll know what I'm referring to, because I talked about it here on our program. Our recently elected governor, elected as a Democrat, Jim Justice, announced at President Trump's Huntington rally that the very next day he would be changing his political party affiliation from Democrat back to Republican. And the fact of the matter is that that our governor, Jim Justice, was a longtime Republican and changed to Democrat only, it appears, to run for the Democratic nomination for governor. He got the nomination. The Democratic Party of West Virginia supported him, contributed to his campaign, and against the strong tide of Trump supporters in West Virginia, President Trump won West Virginia by more than 62% of the vote. Even though he was registered as a Democrat, Jim Justice was able to buck the tide and get elected as a Democratic governor of West Virginia. But here we are, just coming out of the first legislative session under this governor, which was extremely frustrating for the state and for the governor. Jim Justice accused the Democrats in the state legislature of walking away from him and making it impossible for him to fashion a meaningful budget for the state. And since they walked away from him, he was going to walk away from them by switching his affiliation to Republican. It turns out that Governor Justice accompanied President Trump in the limousine from the airport to Huntington, to the rally in Huntington. I think everybody kind of knew that, but I don't know whether anybody realized how significant that limousine ride might be, given the fact that the governor was going to switch parties at the rally. Well, this past 4 or 5 days, the impact of that party switch has begun to surface. Rumors have come out of Washington in the last 4 or 5 days that President Trump is considering asking West Virginia's Democratic Senator Joe Manchin to join his administration as a new Secretary of Energy. President Trump's current Secretary of Energy is former Governor Rick Perry of Texas. And the word is that Perry was going to move from energy to the Department of Homeland Security to replace John Kelly, who now is Special Advisor to the President, Chief of Staff. If you remember, he was asked to replace Scaramucci week before last. That meant that the Secretary of Homeland Security position was vacant. And the reports coming out of Washington from the media were that Rick Perry was going to be asked to move from energy to Homeland Security, and that President Trump was contemplating asking Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia to take over as his new Secretary of Energy. And that hit the papers here. So far, it's not been confirmed. So far, there's been no word from Senator Manchin about whether, in fact, he would take this appointment if it indeed is offered to him. But the fact of the matter is, if Senator Manchin does take that appointment, that's going to leave a Senate seat from West Virginia vacant. And that's going to give Governor Justice the opportunity to fill it. And even though Joe Manchin is a Democrat, there's no requirement that Governor Justice replace him with yet another Democrat. In fact, the thinking here in West Virginia is that Justice, given his recent party switch, would most likely appoint a Republican to the West Virginia Senate seat vacated by Joe Manchin. That would mean that both of West Virginia's senators would be Republicans. One of them, the current one, Shelley Moore Capito, of course, is a Republican. But more importantly, what that would mean is that it would increase the number of Republican senators in the United States Senate by 1, and it would decrease the number of Democratic senators by one. Given the situation that Republican efforts to overturn, to repeal and replace Obamacare encountered, which is to defeat by one vote, this particular political move, this game of musical chairs that's seemingly going on with the state of West Virginia, could have severe, serious implications on the national level. It would be enough to overcome the opposition to the repeal of Obamacare. It might also be enough to pass the Republican McConnell replacement for Obamacare, which most medical experts and many of the people in the know in the country, including the Congressional Budget Office, have already reported would be a disaster in terms of the millions of people that would lose their health care. It would also make Republican efforts to reform the tax structure much more likely to bear fruit. And on and on and on. In other words, what we see taking shape here in West Virginia is the possibility that the overwhelming majority by which President Trump was able to carry West Virginia, only the state of Wyoming gave him a larger vote margin than did the voters here in West Virginia. This situation is making it very likely that President Trump is going to reap benefits from the state of West Virginia that go far beyond the electorate advantage that he had here. It's giving him a way to take advantage of it in ways that nobody expected. Many people here are quite concerned and confused by the whole thing. It speaks to the challenge to the Democratic Party here in West Virginia, which affects me because I happen to be a member of that organization, of that group. And it kind of suggests that the Democratic Party in West Virginia is going to be left floundering and leaderless. As of now, the most prominent Democrat in West Virginia is Joe Manchin. And if he signs on to President Trump's administration, and Governor Jim Justice has already switched from Democrat to Republican, that promises to leave the Democratic Party in this state floundering. And it seems likely to promise an impact on the national level, which few people here could anticipate. To some people, it makes that limousine ride from the airport to the Huntington rally seem like a pretty important limousine ride, if these were the kinds of things that were talked about in the car. But anyway, that's one of the things that's happened while we've been away. I think it's quite significant. Something else has happened since the last time we were together. Fortunately, I'm not talking about the North Korean situation, because crossing my fingers, I have to say that so far nothing's happened on that front, and nothing happening is the best we can hope for at this point, because it was beginning to look last week like we were headed to a nuclear crisis that was the most serious since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The question, and I really can't answer this, that really begs attention is whether, in fact, that issue has gradually begun to settle a little bit and cool a little bit, or whether, in fact, what we're seeing is the media focusing on other issues and kind of pushing that one toward, putting that one on the back burner, so to speak. I think what most of us hoped for was that nothing would happen, nothing would come of it. So far, that seems to be the case. But this past weekend, of course, and this has been the coverage in the media all through the weekend, has been the confrontation that occurred as a result of the march of white supremacists in Charlottesville, Virginia. A situation which resulted in well in excess of 20 people being severely injured and resulted in the deaths of 3. One as a result of a car that was driven into a crowd of anti-protesters, anti-white supremacist protesters, killing 1 and originally wounding well over 19. Now I think the number's in the mid-20s. And then later on that day, 2 Virginia state troopers who were in a helicopter that was involved in the confrontation and indeed was, involved in crowd control during the situation that was unfolding in Charlottesville. The helicopter crashed and both state troopers on it were killed. The result was then that 3 lives were lost and a couple of dozen lives and families' welfare were left floundering as a result of the events that occurred in Charlottesville this week. Many people believed that the very fact that the march was permitted was going to create a situation which could produce violence, and indeed it did. It was the largest gathering of white supremacists in one place in a long time. David Duke was present. Richard Spencer was present. Many people believed that the situation was tailor-made for trouble, and indeed it happened. The issue, of course, is the right of different voices to be heard, of different voices and points of view to be aired and to be heard. And this has been a matter of debate in our nation for some time over the issue of the First Amendment, specifically the free speech, free press, freedom of assembly elements of the First Amendment. How absolute are these rights, or should these rights be guaranteed? Here at the Virtual Center, we've done a little bit with this in the past. We've recognized that through history, there have been a number of people, prominent people, who have believed that First Amendment rights were, if not absolute, very close to absolute. That any efforts to stifle First Amendment freedoms was a violation of one's constitutional rights. On the other hand, there have been those who have advocated caution and who have argued that, like any other freedoms mentioned in our Constitution or in the Bill of Rights specifically, the exercise of these rights must always be weighed against the public interest. That there are responsibilities that go with the exercise of these rights. And that if it looks like violence and indeed the loss of life might be the result, then society is within its rights to limit First Amendment freedoms in that kind of a situation. And this debate has gone on and on. I can remember not too long ago here at the Virtual Center talking about this in the 1790s during the confrontation, emerging confrontation, which was going to evolve into the two-party system here in America. The emergence of Republican opposition to the Hamilton Federalist group within the Washington administration in the early 1790s. And later on in the 1790s, when Federalists passed the very controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a violation of law to criticize the president or to criticize the administration or its policies. The emerging Republican opposition in Congress, headed by James Madison, was very outspoken about the degree to which censorship of particular points of view, because they were unpopular, violated the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. In this particular case, James Madison was advocating controls. Through the 90s, he had advocated the right to free speech, the right of the second party to organize, a right which was challenged by President George Washington in his farewell address in 1796, when President Washington chose to not run for a third term. Under those conditions, Madison believed that Congress passing the Alien and Sedition Acts was a violation of the First Amendment because it was an effort to censor Americans' First Amendment rights, freedoms. And that debate has continued at certain times throughout the history, especially the judicial history of our country. In the 20th century, one must focus on the name Hugo Black in order to concentrate on a Supreme Court justice who advocated the idea that these First Amendment freedoms were pretty close to absolute. Black challenged the late 19th century, early 20th century idea that freedom of speech did not go so far as to give an individual the right to scream fire in a crowded movie theater. If you remember that ruling, that statement by Justice Holmes. Black questioned that because it smacked of censorship. And throughout the 20th century, Black became the most outspoken proponent of near absolute exercise of the First Amendment. That issue came up this weekend in Charlottesville. And of course, we know what happened. But as has so often happened in the first 6 months of the Trump administration, the event itself was trumped, pun intended, was trumped by the president himself. Because in his reaction to the violence underway in Charlottesville on Saturday, the president spoke against violence from all sides. But he was very unwilling to pin the responsibility for the violence on the white supremacists who precipitated it. And consequently, there's many, many critics of President Trump's reaction or behavior in this particular situation. Many of the most outspoken criticisms coming from prominent Republicans, members of his own party, who believe that the president is equivocating here by suggesting that all sides in this Charlottesville situation are responsible for the violence. And that, of course, takes us back to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, in which he raised the questions about civil disobedience in Birmingham. And from his jail cell, he talked about those, especially ministers, fellow ministers, who argued that these civil rights protesters, King included, who came in here and precipitated freedom marches, were responsible for provoking violence. And King made the point that it was the laws of segregation, of discrimination, that provoked the violence, not the action of protesters, peaceful protesters, whose principal goal was to call attention to segregation, to Jim Crow in Birmingham. It seems to me that that same situation can be transferred to the Charlottesville situation. To what extent did the founders intend these First Amendment freedoms to be absolute? To what extent did they intend that they be weighed against the public interest? That matters like the potential for violence be considered in the issuing of the parade permits. I don't think we have a definitive answer to that problem. It depends on who you talk to. But there's something else that I think all of us need to consider here. And it's the priorities of the president himself. It's the degree to which whether one can pin the responsibility for the violence which occurred on the white supremacists who occasioned the situation which led to that violence. There's absolutely no question that the young man from Ohio, alleged to have driven the car into the crowd of counter-protesters, killing one woman, there's absolutely no question of liability and responsibility there for that act of violence. Constitutes second-degree murder. We know that. The question is then, is the entire violence situation which occurred the responsibility of those who would exercise their speech, their right to parade, their right to be heard? Or are those correct who argue that all of those who engage in violence are equally responsible for the outcome? Which seems to be the kind of middle-of-the-road position that the president took in his comments, for which the president is taking a lot of heat. But the one thing we know about President Trump in the 6 months he's been in office, he's used to taking a lot of heat. He seems to solicit heat, because with heat comes attention. With attention comes a visibility. And more that seems to be what drives this president. The headlines in today's New York Times refer specifically to this issue. At a meeting of a group of CEOs of major manufacturing firms, one of the men present who was on the advisory group of manufacturers appointed by the president was the CEO of Merck Pharmaceuticals, an African American named Frazier, who resigned from the commission in opposition, in disagreement with President Trump's behavior. More specifically, with President Trump's refusal to pin the blame for the violence where Mr. Frazier believed it deserved, it was warranted, which is with the white supremacists who scheduled the march. Purpose of which, of course, was to block the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville. The headline in the New York Times points out that in reaction to Frazier's resignation from the advisory group of manufacturers, President Trump took to Twitter and attacked Frazier personally and said now that he's chosen to resign from the advisory group, that'll give him more time to concentrate on lowering the rates that Merck charges for its pharmaceuticals, for its drugs. The abominably high, unfair rates that pharmaceuticals charge. And of course, this is pretty typical, it seems to me, of President Trump's reaction to criticism. He comes back stronger than the criticism was originally intended. When he is criticized, he comes back with guns blazing, as he did in this particular situation. Very, very consistent as far as his behavior is concerned. So as far as this issue goes, that, as far as I know at this point, that's where we are. We've pretty much consumed the first hour of our program today on this particular issue. I think it is extremely significant. I think it relates to another issue which is extremely significant as well. And this is the one which, for lack of a better term, many of those who study our political system refer to as identity politics. Many of those people who have been concentrating on identity politics criticized Democrats and blamed the loss of Hillary Clinton's campaign last November to President Trump on the overzealous nature with which Democrats pursued identity politics. And this is warranting a lot of discussion. And I would suggest to you that this issue in Charlottesville may be a lot of different things, but one of them clearly is the issue of group identity. When one side marched under the flags and under the rubric of white supremacists, white supremacy. So I think we have here a lot, in addition to a lot of other things, a contemporary example of the realities of identity politics and what the implications of these might be in our political system. When we come back, after we pause for take a 5-minute break, I'd like to pursue this issue of identity politics in a little bit more detail, because I think it is really very significant. And then if we have time, I'd like to get into a few of the things that I've been dealing with, and if we can't do it today, then we'll do it when we return at our next live broadcast, which will be Wednesday. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Monday. Today is the 14th day of August in the year 2017. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back for our second hour. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this Monday. Today is the 14th day of August in the year 2017. We're a little bit rusty all around, it appears, because we've been gone so long, and I can't tell you how happy we all are to be back, and how uncomfortable it is to have to say that we're going to miss tomorrow's program live. Because we're not going to be able to have anybody produce it, because I know that Bob and Agnes have an appointment tomorrow that they have to keep. So we won't be live tomorrow, but we'll be back Wednesday for sure. Let me begin the program this hour, as I usually do, by giving you some of the basic details of how to access and become a participant in this ongoing conversation, as Bob calls it, during his introduction to the Virtual Center. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate one-on-one with me and trust me to get your ideas and your thoughts on the air, then I invite you to send me an email and compose your thoughts for me, and I'd be glad to share them with our listeners. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, WAOBRIEN 906, all lowercase, no punctuation, @gmail.com. And on our Facebook page, if you go to Facebook, just go to the search box and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. Let me remind you of two things. And this I went into a little bit further detail on each of these at the beginning of our program today, an hour ago. The first is that I'm going to be beginning a class on Wednesday, and I will be using the Facebook page, the Virtual Center Facebook page, to post documents for students. I will identify the documents, the postings, that are directed to students by introducing them as directed towards students in the History 152 class. That doesn't mean that you can't, as a listener here at the Virtual Center, that you can't look at those documents. I mean, they're all historical documents, and many of them, I hope, you'll find very beneficial. But those particular postings are going to be principally for students in the class, and I'll be explaining that when I meet the students the first time on Wednesday morning. The second announcement is that we will not be live tomorrow, as I mentioned, because Bob and Agnes have an appointment, and we will not have anybody to produce the program, which is really what happened when they were on vacation last week. We were not able to produce last week either. So what that means is that it obviously speaks to the fact that I'm not a producer, and I depend on somebody to produce the program. And if that somebody is not there, then obviously I can't proceed. So I do apologize, but I ask for your indulgence, and please join us. We'll be back live at our regular time on Wednesday. I mentioned at the top of the hour before we took our break that I'd like to get into a little bit about identity politics. Not only because it is so significant, it's been the focus of a lot of study as people try to understand and explain President Trump's victory in last November's election. There's absolutely no question that focusing on this idea of identity politics gives one access to a very viable explanation for the Trump victory. Obviously not the only explanation, but clearly one that makes some sense. So I think that is very significant. The second thing that makes identity politics is that it keeps coming up over and over again, and this recent weekend situation in Charlottesville is an example of it. And because it's so timely, and because the issue itself is so significant, it seemed to me to make sense that we spend a little bit of time on it here at the Virtual Center. Again, if you would like to weigh in on this, if this is an issue that you feel you've got something to say that you feel people ought to hear, then I do invite you to pick up the phone and dial us and get on the air directly. Area code 304-663-4676. And as you know, Agnes is in the studio, and she'd be glad to get you on the air if you call. Let's look and think about for a moment this idea of what many of these folks are calling identity politics. First of all, what is it? The whole idea of identity politics stems from a challenge that American society has had from the very beginning. We know that America from the very beginning was populated by immigrants coming here from a variety of different places through Europe at first and then from around the world. We know that a significant constituency of new arrivals who came here against their own will were black slaves. But the fact of the matter is, when slavery was abolished with the Civil War and the constitutional amendments passed as a result of it, America was challenged with the need to assimilate millions of blacks into the mainstream of American society. This presents the challenge. What exactly does assimilation mean? The fact of the matter is it means different things to different people. To some, I would argue to many, assimilation means that if you come into this country from another culture, if you come into this country speaking a different language than English, if you come into this country a member of a religion other than Christian, if you come into this nation with an accent, if you come into this society and your skin is not you are not Caucasian, your skin is not white. Then the issue becomes, what does assimilation mean? Is assimilation the idea that whatever you were that makes you different from what Americans are, your responsibilities once you relocate here are to abandon all that makes you different and replace it with all that makes you the same? Does assimilation into our culture, into our nation, becoming an American, does that mean that you have to find a way to get rid of all of those things that identify you as different, and that instead you must adopt all of those things that identify you as like us? Many people believe that. But there are many other people who believe something different. And that is that what makes America unique in the world is that here, as a result of statements of principle and vision, like that portion of the Declaration of Independence, the individual rights protected under our Constitution and under our state constitutions, all of these things mean that here in America, an individual can remain an individual. One of the things that many people believe makes this nation great is its diversity, is its ability to find a way and fashion a society that makes it possible for so many different people from so many different places who have unique features that are so different from the features of others. Somehow we seem to find a way that these people can live together in peace and in mutual respect. Throughout our history, it's been a major theme of our American story. To be realistic, it isn't perfect. There are many, many examples of situations in which we didn't live up to the promise that our forefathers gave to us, that we were not up to the challenge that they issued to us. There's no question that a major theme of American history has been America's challenge to wrestle with this idea of assimilation. Call it integration. Call it what you will. But the fact of the matter is, the historical record of this country is littered with examples of very uncomfortable situations and episodes in which Americans, in some cases a few, in other cases many, have not been able to live up to the promise of America. Many groups within our society who have believed that they were victims of discrimination they were people who were being discriminated against or not treated fairly merely because they were different in some ways from everybody else. Many people believed that our court system, our Constitution, dictates that they have a legitimate grievance which they have a right to be resolved in the courts. Many people believe that it is America's challenge to live up to the promise of its own creed, that all people are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that in order to protect these rights, governments are created, deriving their power from the consent of the governed. And that here in America, whenever government fails to live up to the promise of its own creed, then the people not only have the right, they have the responsibility to replace that government with one that will adhere to the strict code that America is founded upon. America has always bragged about, has always celebrated the idea of diversity. We have it in our motto, E pluribus unum, from many, one. What America has always claimed its mission to be is the dual purpose of making many one when one becomes the only logical, legitimate objective. But at the same time, allowing the many to remain individuals as well. We have taken on the challenge of integrating our society and at the same time celebrating, not just admitting, not just allowing, but actually celebrating the differences that make America unique. We have gone even further than that. We have called attention to the fact that what makes America particularly great is our ability to recognize the benefits and the value of our differences. And at the same time, to not allow those differences to divide us. We brag about, we celebrate our ability to meet this challenge, but at the same time, periodically we're forced to recognize that we haven't quite mastered that challenge. This past weekend in Charlottesville provided a clear example of exactly that. Pluralism, diversity, E pluribus unum, is the ultimate objective the pluribus or the unum? Is the ultimate goal to preserve the distinctions between people, or is the ultimate goal to obliterate them? Think of the number of people who engage in heated conversation because recorded messages on their telephone when they call somebody or a company or a corporation acknowledges that there are many Spanish-speaking people in America. So oftentimes what you find is the ability to get the Spanish translation of a particular message along with the English translation. Many citizens believe that's wrong. Many citizens believe that makes the creation of unum very difficult because it speaks to an overemphasis on pluribus. Think of the instructions whenever you buy something that needs to be assembled. The instructions are always available in both English and Spanish. Sometimes they're also available in French and German. But the fact of the matter is, all of these things speak to the existence of the challenge that we're talking about. How real, how substantive is Americans' commitment to overcoming the potential problems from this and continuing America's march toward the solution of these problems? Many people believe that the demise of civic education in this country is one of the reasons why so many people believe that they have the right not to accept this idea of unum, while others believe that they have the right not to accept the pluribus. I can't count the number of people that I have heard say, when people come to this country to live, they have a responsibility to speak English. They have a responsibility to dress like the rest of us. They don't have the right to dress differently. They don't have the right to demand special accommodations because they're different. If America is going to remain united, if we're going to be one country, that it's important that people be willing to give up those things that identify them or signify them as different and begin to work toward adopting those things that enable us to be considered one of us. All of that sounds great in theory, in the abstract. But what do you do when the things that separate us are based on the color of one's skin, or the makeup or the features of one's face, one's eyebrows, or the accent that comes out of their mouth, or the way they worship God, or don't? Is this a nation that can afford to make these kinds of concessions to people's divisiveness and at the same time not expect problems to come as a result? Let's historically be real here. At the turn of the century, coming into the 20th century, the transition from the 19th into the 20th century, at the height of the Industrial Revolution in America, when American corporations were struggling desperately to find a workforce to work in the mills and man the factories and the machines that were together outproducing the ability of every other nation in the world to produce at the beginning of the 20th century. The result was that individual opportunity seemed to be available here more than anywhere else. And people were coming from all over the world to take advantage of it. In the year 1905, the United States admitted more immigrants in one year ever than in its history before. To many Americans, America was being overwhelmed with foreigners. We were being inundated with people who were coming here from parts of the world that didn't speak English, who couldn't communicate. Thus, they couldn't get a job. Thus, they couldn't take care of themselves. And instead became individuals who seemed to need to be taken care of by others. Many of our inner cities were confronted with the challenge that many immigrants coming into this country were from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were Roman Catholics. The nature, the flavor of many of our major cities became predominantly Irish, predominantly Italian. Most likely, our major cities would divide up into neighborhoods. There'd be a little Ireland, a little Poland, a little Italy, a little Russia, a little Hungary. As immigrants naturally gravitated toward their own. And in the face of all of this, America's political leaders look to our schools, to our public education system, as a way to turn this potential chaos into the kind of success that fulfilled America's promise to become one from so many. And the whole curriculum of America's education system began to change. No longer were the schools primarily geared towards preparing people for work in the factories. Values or objectives like responsibility, humility, dependability, punctuality, respect for authority, and all the other things that seemed to be priorities for people that were going to work in the industrial plant that was American industry. Increasingly, the curriculum of our schools began to reflect the realities of diversity and pluralism, the challenges the nation faced in trying to accommodate and assimilate so many from so many different places. The term that became very prominent as we entered the 20th century was the idea of the melting pot. The belief that America was one of the few places in the world where so many could come and mix with others. And the result would be unum. The result would be the creation of Americans. America was in the business of creating Americans, of taking people who came here and advertised their differences and somehow converting them into people that could fit. And that was America's melting pot. But there were problems. Many people began to believe that they were being asked as immigrants to abandon their heritage, that they were being asked or required to not speak their native language, to not have access to newspapers in languages other than English, that their children were being force-fed English in the public schools to the point that when they came home at night, they couldn't even communicate with their own parents who didn't speak English at all. And many immigrant groups began to complain vociferously about this. Many cities experienced violent riots where national groups from one neighborhood would attack groups from another nationality in an adjoining neighborhood. As never before in America, the issue of anti-Semitism began to emerge in many parts of America as Americans increasingly began to focus not only on the number of Jewish Americans in this country, but more specifically on the apparent economic success of these Jewish Americans. To many people, the character of Shylock from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice began to characterize people's dislike of, hatred for Jews and what they became in America and how much success they had here. I don't think one need to remind that a key ingredient of the rise of Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy was based to a certain extent on anti-Semitism, as Jews became the scapegoats. The way that these self-interested political leaders explained the problems of the nation and pinned them on the influence of Jews. And of course, the result in Germany from Nazism, of course, was the Holocaust. But that wasn't all of it. In 1917, Russia experienced a revolution that brought communists to power, that brought Lenin to power. And suddenly the threat of international communism leapt from the pages of Karl Marx's Das Kapital and suddenly became a threat to all those people in America who believed in free enterprise. They saw the growing union movement in America's industrial plant. This union movement being infiltrated with radicals from Southern and Eastern Europe who were deeply indoctrinated into socialism, if not outright Marxism and communism, and were committed ideologically to the overthrow of America's free enterprise system, the destruction of freedom in America. And many Americans began to respond accordingly to this. The Palmer raids in 1919 under Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, where government began this crackdown on foreign immigrants, and the implication that there were just too many damn immigrants in this country and we had to get rid of them. And suddenly America's creed was back on the table, in question once again. Can we continue to become the haven for so many that are different, and continually face the challenge of trying to make so many that are different all the same so they can live together? And the result was that discrimination in various forms became the reality of American life. We focus on civil rights, African Americans, ex-slaves, segregation in the South. But we saw in the Northeast in the 60s and 70s the fact that many of our major cities were segregated as well. The difference was that they weren't segregated by law, they were segregated by choice. As many people who were like other people wanted to live in the same neighborhoods. Consequently, our cities became ghettoized. Crime ran rampant. Our police were being accused of discrimination and undue force against certain groups, especially Black Americans living in our inner cities. And Americans became inundated with suggestions that these people not only were unable to become self-sufficient and independent Americans, but increasingly were beginning to take advantage of our generosity and were finding ways to get on the system. In the 1970s and 80s, we remember statements from none other than Ronald Reagan and his exaggeration about the welfare queens who were driving to pick up welfare checks in Cadillacs in many of our inner cities. And many hardworking, lower class and burgeoning middle class Americans became angry. It hasn't ended. It's still going on. Here in West Virginia, this past weekend was voucher weekend for back to school. People in the state who qualified were receiving clothing vouchers to go to our department stores in order to buy school supplies and clothes for their children for the return to school. Our malls were packed. Here in Beckley, you couldn't get into Crossroads Mall this weekend. You couldn't find a place to park in the parking lot. And how many comments did we hear from people who were standing in line at department stores to pay for items they purchased, only to find themselves standing in line behind somebody who had only clothing vouchers, who didn't have to pay any money for their kids' clothes. Well, I'm standing there with $20 bills in my hand paying for my children's clothes. And the resentment that came as a result of that. This is real. It's the sore that defines the challenge that America has taken on and been struggling with since the very beginning of its existence as a nation. I don't know whether you're a liberal, whether you're conservative, whether you're unsure. But the fact is, there are many people who believe, maybe we can't do this. Maybe what America stands for is too ambitious. Maybe what we stand for is something that's impossible, that's beyond the ability of human beings to behave that way. Maybe the discrimination and bigotry and all of those things that we see rearing its ugly head in so many different places, maybe that's what man's about. Maybe that's human nature. Maybe we can't do anything about it. But on the other hand, we have the founders. We have Jefferson and Madison. Jefferson, who said that there's a moral sense, a conscience within every one of us. It's like every other limb. It can be strengthened with exercise. What we've got to do is educate our people into understanding, knowing, and being committed to the values that America is about. Maybe the problem is we've abandoned that mission. We've become so condescending to people's individual rights to not be educated in that way that we're dealing with a population that doesn't really understand and know what America is about. These white supremacists that came in from all over the nation this weekend at Charlottesville to deliver their message of hatred and bigotry in a nation whose creed suggests that that's not what America is about. That's not what America was created to accomplish. That's not the way Americans will choose to live. And they claim the right to do it under our First Amendment freedoms. The right to say anything, do anything that they want, because this is America and they are free. They are free to spew the message of hatred, and Americans can't do anything about it, because to do that would violate their own frame of government, their own constitution. Talk about political correctness. Talk about it. Think about the idea of political correctness, and then listen to the speech of the President of the United States this weekend in the response to the violence in Charlottesville. I think, and I'm not being objective, I don't think anybody who's alive can be objective about this. It's too real. It's too human. The sore is too raw. I think all of us have to confront the fact that because we have a Bill of Rights, that gives people the right to say and do things to people and have their rights to do it protected. It suggests that the only truth, the only unalienable rights that people have is the right to say and do whatever they want to other people. That people have the right to not respect the humanity of other people. If people genuinely believe that, it speaks to a failing of the American system. It speaks to our failure to teach the reality of what this nation is about. what those who went before us decided for us that would make this nation different and unique. This would be the place where humanity would be recognized, worshipped, valued, honored, where everybody's individuality would be respected. But in return, benefiting from the benefits of living in this society required not only that your rights be respected, but that you also had an obligation or responsibility to protect or respect the rights of others. And if you didn't, you were guilty of violating what America is all about. What we saw this weekend is that the President of the United States refused to stand up for the values of the nation that he was elected to lead. He basically was refusing to accept the responsibility and his obligation to speak to the rights and the self-worth of every individual in America. Whatever religion they are, whatever color they are, whatever language they speak, whatever accent comes out of their mouth. Basically, what the president's speech about Charlottesville indicated, that he is unwilling to hold those responsible for the violence of this weekend responsible. The Attorney General of the United States reports to him. The Attorney General of the United States has a record, his own personal record, that's very questionable when it comes to human rights. Therefore, it's absolutely critical that the difference between right and wrong clearly come down from on high, from the person elected to lead this nation and to organize and lead its people in pursuit of what the creation of this nation is all about, what it must be about. Many experts believe that Hillary Clinton lost the election last November because she and her party, the Democrats, and I believe that this is partly true, became so focused on winning the election that she tailored her message to Hispanics, to women, to African Americans, to the LGBT community, to the identity of individual groups, and believed that by delivering a different message that was appropriate to one group but maybe not to the others was enough to win enough votes for her to be elected. Ironically, what she did, what Democrats did in the process, is leave working class, uneducated whites, mostly males, to feel that nobody was pitching a message to them. They were the only group in America that wasn't acknowledged as a group. They were ignored. They were taken advantage of. They were seemingly being taken for granted. Excuse me. and they reacted accordingly when a candidate from out of nowhere began to speak to them, began to acknowledge their existence, began to acknowledge what they believed was their own victimhood, who seemed to be speaking directly to them, who spoke to their prejudices, spoke to their fears, spoke to their hopes, spoke to their bigotry, spoke to their racism. They are not, or were not, deplorables, which is the political term that was used to describe them. They were people that didn't believe that they were receiving a fair shot in a system where they were somehow expected to give everybody else a shot, but not to get one themselves. They were hurting, and nobody not only didn't seem to care, didn't even seem to notice. And they reacted accordingly. And we're all paying the price. I believe that this weekend is a very important one, this past weekend. I believe America has been challenged. I believe America has been challenged to stand up and fight for what this nation is based upon. This is, after all, what makes America exceptional. Not what we've done, damn it, because we haven't done enough. What makes this nation acceptable is that it's the only nation on the face of the earth that is committed to doing what we do better than anybody else has ever done it before. The challenge is ours. Let's do it. We've reached the end of our program, the top of the hour. It's 3 o'clock, maybe a minute or so beyond. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Again, we will not be with you tomorrow, but we will be back on Wednesday. I invite you to be with us at our regular start time, 1 p.m. in the East. For Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the other folks at Head On, thank you so very, very much for listening. Please encourage your friends to tune in and to participate as actively as they choose to in this program. That's what it's about. That's what its purpose is. And we welcome you again. Thank you.